picture this. It's February 4th, 1963. A massive ship, the SS Marine Sulphur Queen, is sailing through the Gulf of Mexico. On board, there are 39 people. And then, it just vanishes. No SOS, no warning, nothing. It just disappears, leaving behind a mystery that lasts to this day.
Now, I know that sounds like something out of a spooky movie, but for the families of those 39 crew members, this was an all-too-real nightmare. So you have to ask yourself, right? How does a ship longer than a football field and a half just disappear off the face of the earth? So, a year later, the official U.S. Coast Guard report comes out, and basically, it just states the obvious. The ship sank. But here's the thing. With absolutely no wreckage to study, the report couldn't answer the real questions. How did it happen? And more importantly, why? This forced investigators to look for clues, not in the ocean, but in the ship's own very troubled past. To really try and understand what went wrong, we have to piece together its last voyage. Because you have to remember, this wasn't just a hunk of metal. It was a workplace, a temporary home for 39 people, who were, completely unknowingly, sailing straight into oblivion. The Queen was on what should have been a routine trip, carrying over 15,000 tons of molten sulfur. Now, this was not your average cargo. It's a hazardous material that has to be kept liquid at unbelievably high temperatures, which basically turned the whole ship into a kind of floating, high-stakes science experiment. And the suddenness of it all is just bone-chilling. At 1:25 in the morning on February 4th, a radio station picks up a message, but it wasn't a mayday. It wasn't a distress call. It was just a simple, personal message from one of the crew to his family. And after that, absolute silence.
Okay, so this is where the mystery really starts to unfold when you dig into the ship's backstory. See, this vessel was never designed to carry something so dangerous. It was actually a celebrated war hero that was later radically transformed for a new, and as it turns out, much, much riskier life.
I mean, the transformation was just incredible. It started out in 1944 as the Esso New Haven, a real workhorse during World War II, built to carry fuel oil in lots of separate tanks. But then in 1960, they literally ripped out its insides to create one giant 306-foot-long tank for that molten sulfur. This completely changed the ship's entire structure, its balance, everything. By the time it was converted, the once proud ship was really showing its age. And this quote from a crew member's wife, it's just haunting. It tells you everything you need to know. The people who knew that ship best didn't see it as some state-of-the-art carrier. They saw it as a risk. And then you have to consider the heat. To keep that sulfur in a liquid state, it had to be kept at a constant 251 degrees Fahrenheit. That's more than double the temperature needed for its old cargo, fuel oil. Imagine that extreme, nonstop heat putting immense stress on the ship's old, tired steel, day in and day out. So, if the risky conversion wasn't concerning enough, the ship's actual service record as a sulfur carrier was, well, frankly, terrifying. In just a little over 2 years of service, it was hit by a relentless string of accidents and failures. Just look at this timeline. A huge sulfur spill, getting battered by a hurricane, running aground twice in the same day, another big spill, and then something truly alarming starts happening. Constant fires breaking out in installation that was soaked with leaking sulfur. You know, this isn't just a string of bad luck. This is a pattern. These are symptoms of a very, very sick ship. And get this, the problems weren't unique to the Sulphur Queen. The entire class of ship, the T2 tanker, which was built really fast during the war, was known for having common disorders. That's a nice way of saying they had serious structural flaws. They were known to crack. In fact, the Sulphur Queen had already had an 18-inch fracture in its hull back in 1961. It was, quite literally, a ticking time bomb. This little detail from the Coast Guard report is just mind-blowing. There was a leak. A known leak, scheduled to be fixed later, that had let somewhere between 20 and 70 tons of sulfur seep out, harden, and just build up in the bottom of the ship. That is a massive amount of weight, totally unaccounted for, throwing the whole ship off balance. It's a clear sign that maintenance had failed, and this vessel was being pushed way past its breaking point. So, with a ship this troubled, we go back to its final days. When the Queen never showed up in Norfolk, a huge search and rescue mission was launched. But they found next to nothing. This is it. This is all they ever found. A few life jackets, some rings, a piece of an oar. But here's the crucial clue. None of this debris showed any evidence of a big fire or a major explosion. The ship itself, all 10,000 tons of it, was never seen again. It just sank into the depths. So without the actual ship to look at, the official investigators could only guess. They came up with a few theories. Maybe there was an explosion in the tanks. Maybe the weak hull finally just gave up and the ship snapped in half. Or maybe, in the rough seas that were reported that night, it just rolled over and couldn't recover. All of these are possible, but without the wreck, none of them could ever be proven. But there's one more theory, one mentioned in the report, that kind of chillingly connects all the dots. The idea is that the molten sulfur could have been giving off explosive gases, like hydrogen sulfide, which then built up in the empty spaces around the main tank. And what was already happening in those spaces? Right, those constant smoldering fires in the sulfur-soaked insulation. A perfect ignition source for a devastating explosion. So while the final, terrible moments of the Marine Sulphur Queen and her 39 crew will probably always be a mystery, the disaster itself wasn't for nothing. It ended up being a brutal but really necessary wake-up call for the entire shipping industry. In what is a pretty remarkable admission, the Coast Guard basically said, "We got this one wrong." They admitted their inspectors treated the ship just like any other oil tanker, and not the unique, incredibly dangerous, custom-built vessel it actually was. They just weren't familiar with the risks of its cargo or its radical design. And this is exactly how tragedy leads to change. The recommendations that came out of this one disaster completely transformed maritime safety. We're talking new tools to measure explosive gases, way better inspection rules for unique ships, and maybe most importantly, the rule that ships have to carry emergency radio beacons or EPIRBs. The 39 men on the Sulphur Queen had no way to call for help. Because of them, today, nearly every ship on the ocean does. In the end, the story of the Marine Sulphur Queen is just a powerful reminder that so many of our most important safety rules are written in blood. All the red flags were there: the old hull, the dangerous cargo, that long history of accidents. The tragedy really leaves us with a question that's still relevant in every industry today. How do we finally learn to see the warning signs before the disaster happens?